Picture this: Madrid, the Alcázar Palace, on a suffocating morning in the year 1665. The air inside the fortress is heavy, almost unbreathable, a mix of incense smoke, candle wax, and the metallic tang of blood-soaked cloth. Behind massive oak doors, Queen Mariana of Austria cries out in agony. Her labor is long and punishing. Courtiers stand frozen, their whispers trembling, as if every word might disturb fate itself. For they know this is not just the birth of a royal child, it is the birth of Spain's future, and perhaps the final chance to save a dying dynasty. Outside the chamber, pacing relentlessly across cold marble tiles, is King Philip IV, Mariana's husband and her uncle. Yes, her uncle. 30 years her senior, a man who had already watched heirs collapse like fragile glass before his eyes. Philip Prospero, once celebrated as the hope of Spain, had perished in childhood, his frail body unable to withstand even the smallest illness. Others, miscarried or buried before their first steps, left the court in despair. Each coffin lowered into the royal crypt deepened the silence around the Habsburgs, as if an invisible curse coiled tighter with every generation. Now, every breath Mariana takes in her suffering chambers carries the weight of an empire. Beyond the palace walls, Spain staggers. Its armies bleed on foreign fields, its coffers grow thin, its colonies restless. Yet within these walls, the fate of that empire balances on the fragile cries of an unborn child. But this is not simply a matter of chance. This is the culmination of deliberate, calculated choices. For nearly 2 centuries, the Habsburgs have guarded their bloodline like a holy relic. Marriage, to them, was not about companionship or even practical alliance. It was about purity, the obsessive belief that royal power must never be diluted by lesser blood. Uncle to niece, cousin to cousin, marriage after marriage, generation after generation, they closed their circle tighter and tighter. What began as a strategy for political dominance had become an experiment in human endurance, one conducted with all the precision of a funeral march. The courtiers knew this. They had seen the portraits, the protruding jaw, the sullen eyes, the fragile bodies of past heirs. They had watched as medicine failed, as prayers failed, as the empire's might could not protect children born with bodies too frail to live. Now, as Queen Mariana's screams echoed down the corridors, every man and woman in that palace wondered the same unspoken thought: what will emerge this time? At last, the wails of the queen gave way to the wails of a child. But joy did not follow. The attending physicians, men accustomed to the dangers of childbirth, fell into stunned silence. In their arms lay the infant Charles, the future Charles II of Spain. His head was unnaturally large, his body frail, his jaw already showing the grotesque jut that marked his cursed lineage. This was no ordinary child. This was the living embodiment of centuries of obsession. Yet even in this moment of horror, the dynasty's machinery did not stop. Church bells tolled, proclaiming the arrival of a prince destined to rule. Official bulletins praised God's mercy. Artists sharpened their brushes, preparing to paint an heir who must appear strong, noble, and divinely chosen. Spain could not afford to show the truth, that its future king had entered the world already broken. But to understand this tragic beginning, to grasp why an empire would gamble its entire future on a child so visibly cursed, we must step backward. We must trace the roots of this family tree, a web of marriages so tangled that it resembles a spider's trap rather than branches of life. For the story of Charles II does not begin in his cradle. It begins centuries earlier, with a single principle uttered by an emperor, a principle that would guide his descendants toward glory, then ruin. Bella gerant alii, tu felix Austria nube. Let others wage war, you, happy Austria, marry. It was a motto that gave the Habsburgs the world. It would also destroy them. The Habsburgs were not the first dynasty to use marriage as a political weapon, but no family in Europe wielded it with such relentless precision. Their rise began centuries before Charles II's birth, when the family's power was modest compared to other great houses. But through a strategy as cold as it was effective, they built an empire not by war, but by wedding vows. By the late 1400s, Emperor Maximilian Maffei set the pattern. His marriage to Mary of Burgundy brought him not just a wife, but vast territories in the Low Countries, lands of staggering wealth and influence. Maximilian understood something few rulers did. Steel rusts, armies falter, but bloodlines endure. From his reign onward, the Habsburg motto was repeated like a sacred spell. Let others wage war. You, happy Austria, marry. The plan worked. With each carefully arranged union, the Habsburgs absorbed kingdoms like beads strung on a necklace. Spain, Portugal, Naples, Milan, even distant colonies in the New World. By 1519, Charles V inherited an empire so vast that courtiers boasted the sun never set upon it. Yet within his veins already flowed the peril of this strategy. His parents, Philip the Handsome of Castile and Joanna of Castile, were first cousins. The very foundations of Habsburg glory rested on a dangerous genetic gamble. When Charles V abdicated in 1556, weary of ruling an empire too large even for his iron will, he split his inheritance. Austria to his brother Ferdinand I, Spain to his son Philip II. Two branches, both Habsburg, bound by blood and destined to intermarry across generations like two rivers that circled endlessly back into one another. It was Philip II, ruler of Spain, who became the architect of catastrophe. Married 4 times, he treated his personal life as an extension of empire. His first wife, Maria Manuela of Portugal, was his cousin. When she died young, he briefly broke the pattern by wedding Mary Tudor of England, but their union produced no heir. He next married Elizabeth of Valois of France, a rare alliance beyond the family circle. Yet even this small deviation ended when, at the age of 43, he wed his niece Anna of Austria, daughter of his cousin and brother-in-law Maximilian II. She was 20 years old. From that union came Philip III, the child of uncle and niece, a boy who carried more than a crown. He carried the invisible weight of compounded ancestry. To contemporaries, he seemed a legitimate heir of God's will. To modernize, he was another link in the tightening genetic chain. Here, it is worth pausing to understand what the Habsburgs could not. In genetics, every child inherits half of their DNA from each parent. When parents are closely related, the chances of harmful recessive genes pairing together rises sharply. Scientists measure this with something called the coefficient of inbreeding. For normal, unrelated couples, it is nearly 0. For first cousins, it rises to 6.25%. For uncle and niece, as with Philip II and Anna, it jumps to 12. With each generation, the risk does not simply reset. It compounds like debt passed from parent to child. But in the 16th century, such knowledge was centuries away. To the Habsburgs, purity was not a danger but a virtue. They saw themselves as guardians of God's chosen lineage, convinced that closing the blood circle preserved divine favor. The priests who blessed their marriages spoke of sacred bonds, not genetic hazards. The court poets sang of dynastic strength, not hidden weakness. When Philip III grew to manhood, the cycle deepened. He married Margaret of Austria in 1599, his first cousin, and the sister of his sister-in-law. Their genealogical relationship was so complex that even the chroniclers of the day admitted difficulty untangling it. But one fact was clear. Both bride and groom carried the same ancestral burden. Their children would inherit not just crowns and castles, but a dangerous inheritance of identical genes. Among those children was Philip IV, the man whose choices would bring the dynasty to its breaking point. Portraits of him even as a young man reveal the marks, the long face, the heavy jaw, the subtle protrusion that artists softened with flattering brushstrokes. Already the Habsburg jaw was more than legend. It was the visible reminder that the empire's golden age carried a hidden crack. And yet, in the gilded halls of Madrid and Vienna, the system continued. For the Habsburgs, marriage was not just policy, it was destiny. They did not stumble blindly into this path. They walked it with deliberate steps, generation after generation, convinced that in preserving their blood, they were preserving their empire. The irony, of course, is that the empire reached its greatest territorial glory, even as its genetic foundation crumbled. The sun may never have set on Habsburg lands, but shadows had begun to lengthen in the very heart of the dynasty. The stage was set. Spain's might was weakening, its rulers already bearing the physical scars of inbreeding. And yet, the family was about to gamble again, more recklessly than ever before. For Philip IV would not only carry this fragile inheritance, he would double it, marrying a girl who was not only his niece, but already fragile herself. Their union would not just continue the cycle, it would push it to the edge of disaster. Philip IV ascended the Spanish throne in 1621, inheriting not just an empire stretched across oceans, but also the invisible burden of generations of inbreeding. To his subjects he appeared every inch the Habsburg monarch, regal in his bearing, commanding in ceremony. Yet beneath the silks and jewels, portraits reveal the unmistakable signs of the family curse. His jaw, heavy and protruding, bore the exaggerated form of the Habsburg lip. Speaking clearly was often difficult, and meals were a struggle, though painters softened his features to project majesty. In truth, his reign embodied both the grandeur and the decay of Spain, a kingdom still cloaked in imperial pride, but already trembling with decline. Spain in Philip's time was no longer the unstoppable juggernaut of Charles V or Philip II. The 30 Years' War drained the treasury, foreign rivals chipped at Spanish holdings, and colonial riches could no longer hide the empire's structural weaknesses. But in the palace, dynastic concerns outweighed even the losses of armies. For a dynasty obsessed with blood, the central question remained: who would carry the Habsburg line forward? Philip's first marriage to Elizabeth of France produced a promising heir, Prince Balthazar Charles. Brilliant, charming, and popular, the boy was celebrated as Spain's hope. But fate struck cruelly. In 1646, at just 16, Balthazar Charles died suddenly, shattering not only his father's heart, but also the fragile future of the dynasty. The empire that had once seemed eternal now faced the possibility of extinction. The solution was grim and predictable. The family turned inward again. In 1649, 3 years after his son's death, Philip married his niece, Mariana of Austria. She was only 15 years old. Philip, by then 44, was her uncle, her first cousin once removed, and connected to her through multiple other bloodlines. For the Habsburgs, these ties were not red flags, but assurances. In their logic, the purer the blood, the stronger the claim. But Mariana was not strong. Contemporary accounts describe her as frail and nervous, with a pale complexion and an air of constant melancholy. Raised in the rigid Austrian court, she had been destined since childhood to marry within her family. But the reality of becoming queen to her own uncle proved overwhelming. Diplomats noted her frequent illnesses, her awkwardness in public, her retreat into silence when speeches were required. Even her appearance seemed to embody fragility, a queen weighed down by duty she could scarcely bear. Yet she bore children. Some survived only long enough to be baptized, their names recorded briefly before disappearing into the shadows of the royal crypt. One daughter, Maria Theresa, reached adulthood and was married to Louis XIV of France as part of a peace treaty. But the sons, the precious male heirs, remained elusive. Then, in 1657, Mariana gave birth to Philip Prospero. From the moment of his baptism, hope flared again in Spain. He was paraded through ceremonies, dressed in elaborate costumes, his tiny frame cloaked in symbols of power. But hope dimmed quickly. He was sickly, frail, and prone to seizures. Chroniclers describe a boy too weak to walk without assistance, his speech delayed and halting, his immune system so fragile that ordinary childhood fevers nearly claimed his life. Court physicians surrounded him, priests prayed over him, talismans and relics were placed near his bed. Nothing saved him. In 1661, at the age of 4, Philip Prospero died, his small coffin borne into the Escorial, leaving the monarchy once again without an heir. The pressure on Queen Mariana became unbearable. She was still young, but her body was already weakened by miscarriages and grief. The Spanish court, desperate for continuity, pressed her for another son. Every pregnancy was watched with suffocating intensity. Courtiers whispered about divine punishment, about sins that cursed the dynasty. Others saw only the harsh truth that centuries of bloodline purity had created a family tree twisted beyond repair. And so it was, in November of 1665, that Mariana once again endured the agony of childbirth within the Alcázar. Her cries filled the palace corridors, echoing over marble and velvet, while Philip IV paced outside. For him, this was not only a personal trial, it was the very fate of Spain condensed into one fragile moment. When the child was born, it was Charles, small, fragile, deformed, the culmination of generations of choices. A boy who would grow into a king, known across Europe, not as a ruler, but as a living testament to the dangers of dynastic obsession. The courtiers looked upon him with dread. The physicians whispered among themselves. But still the bells rang across Madrid, proclaiming the birth of an heir. Spain would not yet confess its doom. The true horror lay not just in the weakness of this newborn child, but in the recognition, at least among the wise, that this was no accident. This was the inevitable price of Habsburg pride. Charles II of Spain entered the world already burdened by centuries of choices not his own. His birth in 1665 should have been a moment of triumph, a new heir to secure the empire's future. Instead, it was the opening act of a tragedy. The newborn's head was oversized, his body frail, and his jaw grotesquely protruding. The Habsburg lip, once a subtle deformity, now jutted so far forward that he would never chew properly. His limbs trembled with weakness. Even as the midwives wrapped him in swaddling cloth, they knew this was not a healthy child. But Spain could not admit weakness. Bells rang out, sermons declared divine favor, and court painters sharpened their brushes to soften his features into something more regal. Official proclamations spoke of God's mercy. Yet in the private corridors of the Alcázar, whispers spread like wildfire. The boy was cursed, bewitched, a punishment for the sins of the dynasty. As Charles grew, those fears were confirmed. He did not speak until the age of 4, and even then his words were slurred and difficult to understand. He could not walk without help until 8. His tutors struggled in vain to teach him basic reading and writing. Meals were torturous affairs, his jaw deformity making chewing impossible. Instead, he lived on broths, porridges, and liquids, always thin, always sickly. Physicians, priests, and healers crowded his chambers. Some blamed his mother's diet during pregnancy. Others declared he was possessed by demons, and exorcisms were attempted. Priests prescribed relics, holy water, and prayer vigils. Court doctors bled him, purged him, and forced strange concoctions upon him. None of it helped. The truth, invisible to their 17th-century understanding, was simple. Charles was the result of an inbreeding coefficient so extreme it exceeded that of children born to siblings. In modern genetic terms, he carried identical harmful genes from both parents in shocking concentration. Yet he was king. When Philip IV died in 1665, Spain crowned his frail son Charles II. The empire, already bleeding from wars and debts, now had at its head a boy who could not speak clearly, could not eat without assistance, could not rule in any true sense. Around him, ministers and courtiers scrambled to maintain the illusion of monarchy. Ceremonies were choreographed to disguise his disabilities. Portraits flattered him, disguising the grotesque jaw. Ambassadors were carefully instructed how to address him, so they would not expose the reality to foreign courts. But reality leaked out. Whispers traveled across Europe. Spain's king was más muerto que vivo, more dead than alive. Foreign envoys reported home about his seizures, his drooling, his incomprehensible speech. Diplomats described him as childlike, fearful, and easily manipulated. To many, Charles seemed less a monarch than a tragic puppet, a body in royal robes with little will of his own. Still, dynastic duty demanded one thing: marriage. In 1679, at the age of 14, Charles was wed to Marie-Louise of Orléans, niece of France's Louis XIV. She was young, healthy, radiant, everything Charles was not. The wedding, a grand spectacle, hid the terror behind closed doors. Marie-Louise reportedly trembled through the ceremony, while Charles himself appeared confused, barely able to stand without support. Life as Charles's queen was a prison of despair. Her letters home paint a portrait of horror, a husband constantly drooling, unable to converse, prone to seizures. She described him as more dead than alive, and confided her growing certainty that he could never father children. The pressure on her was immense. Every month without an heir was met with suspicion, accusations, whispers of infertility. But those who knew the truth understood. The fault was not hers. The king himself was physically incapable. Their marriage limped on for a decade, unconsummated in any meaningful way, producing no heir. Marie-Louise withered under the strain. At 26, she died suddenly in 1689. Many suspected poison, given the stakes of succession. More likely, she simply succumbed to stress and despair. Charles remarried quickly, this time to Maria Anna of Neuburg, a German princess chosen not for love, but for politics. She entered the Spanish court, aware of the burden, to give Spain an heir. Yet the truth could not be hidden from her for long. She, too, discovered the reality of a husband trapped in a body too broken for the duties of kingship. Her letters speak of his paranoia, his violent outbursts, his obsession with ritual and religion. As the years dragged on, Charles grew increasingly haunted. He believed himself cursed, certain that witches and demons plotted against him. He submitted to endless exorcisms, fasting, and prayers. Priests paraded relics before him, whispering promises of divine intervention. He clung to faith because medicine offered nothing. By his 20s, Charles's appearance shocked even those who knew him best. His skin pale and waxen, his frame thin to the point of emaciation, his hair graying far too soon. He looked like a man decades older than his years. He was, in truth, a living specter, a king who embodied not the majesty of Spain, but the decay of a dynasty. Yet for all his weakness, the entire fate of Spain, perhaps even of Europe, balanced on him. If he produced an heir, the Habsburg line might endure. If he did not, rival powers would descend like vultures. This unbearable truth hung over every day of his reign. And as the years passed with no heir, no child, and no hope, The vultures began to circle,